Now this is the best, strongest Ball of Lightning build for the Sorcerer in Season 2. You can easily clear tier 100 Nightmare dungeons and quickly destroy Uber Lilith without the need of any unique gears. And I highly recommend to watch this video from the beginning to the very end to get the full idea of this build. And check out the tips on how to clear tier 100 Nightmare dungeons and fighting Uber Lilith, because it may answer a majority of your questions. So let's check this out. Okay, so first I'm going to show you clearing this dungeon. And as you can see, I'm doing a tier 100 Nightmare dungeon, and I'm not wearing any unique pieces of gear. This build is really strong and can clear huge groups of enemies. This build can easily melt Uber Lilith and completely destroy Uber Daryl. But the thing is, this build is an endgame build. So this build is very gear dependent, and you need your Paragon Board to do insane amounts of damage. Now the main thing about this build is you do need to build a lot of mana regeneration and ways to get your mana back from either your skills or your gear. And you also need to build some lucky hit chance. The mana regeneration is very important to spam Ball of Lightnings, and you need lucky hit chance to spread Vampiric Curse, so you can apply vulnerable to groups of enemies without the need to always rely on Frost Nova. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next let's check out the skills. Now of course our main damage dealing skill is Ball of Lightning. You can get a insane amount of damage with this skill. The next skill I'm using is Frost Nova, and this will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. The ultimate skill I'm using is Unstable Currents, and this will destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. The next two skills I have are barrier skills, so Flame Shield and Ice Armor, and these barrier skills are really good for survivability. And the next skill I'm using is Teleport, and this is the best and fastest movement skill in the game. Okay, so next let's check out the enchantments. Now the first enchantment I'm using is the Firebolt enchantment, and this will apply burning fire damage to your skills. And the reason I took the Firebolt enchantment, because on the Paragon board there are a couple glyphs that will multiply your damage if you do burning or fire damage. So the Firebolt enchantment will greatly increase your damage. The next enchantment I'm using is the Chain Lightning enchantment, and you will form Chain Lightnings after spending 100 mana. And this enchantment is important when you pair it with this legendary aspect, the recharging aspect, because each time your Chain Lightning bounces, you'll gain mana, and this will allow us to spam Ball of Lightnings for insane damage. Okay, so next for the Vampiric Powers. And I do want to mention that the Vampiric Powers are really important for this build. These Vampiric Powers will give you a huge boost in damage and attack speed. And most important, these Vampiric Powers will also help you apply vulnerable to enemies, so you don't always have to rely on Frost Nova, because your Frost Nova may be on cooldown. So the first Vampiric Power I'm using is Prey on the Weak, and this will increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. But the most important thing on this Vampiric Power is that enemies are vulnerable while affected by a Vampiric Curse from your other Vampiric Powers. And the next Vampiric Power I'm using is a Cursed Touch, and this will apply Vampiric Curse to enemies when we lucky hit. And the Vampiric Curse has a chance to spread to other enemies, so this is the reason why you need to build some lucky hit chance for this build. So you can apply Vampiric Curse on your enemies, which will then apply vulnerable to the enemies because of the Prey of the Weak Vampiric Power. Now the next Vampiric Power I'm using is Metamorphosis, and this will make your evade become unstoppable, which is really good for survivability. And when you evade through enemies, you deal physical damage, and you also apply Vampiric Curse to them, which will also apply vulnerable because of the Prey of the Weak Vampiric Power. The next Vampiric Power I'm using is Ravenous, and this will greatly increase our attack speed when we lucky hit. And last but not least, I'm using the Domination Vampiric Power for the increased damage to stun, immobilize, frozen, or feared enemies. Okay, so that's pretty much the Vampiric Powers I'm using for this build, and the reason why we need lucky hit chance. Okay, so next for the skill tree. But I do want to mention that I do slightly change some skills depending on whether I'm speed farming / farming Uber bosses, or if I want to push high level Nightmare dungeons. Because when pushing high level Nightmare dungeons, you do want to focus more on defense and survivability compared to speed and damage. But I'll share the few skill points to switch around in a dedicated section in this video explaining tips to beat tier 100 Nightmare dungeons. But majority of the time you're going to use this skill tree layout to speed farm and destroy Uber bosses. So let's check this out. So starting with the basic skills, I put 2 points into Firebolt, and this skill is just used for the Firebolt enchantment. Next for the core skills, I put 1 point into Chain Lightning, a point into Enhanced Chain Lightning, and a point into Destructive Chain Lightning. Putting skill points into Chain Lightning is just for the enchantment slot, and having Chain Lightnings flying around will proc a legendary aspect, the Recharging aspect, which will regain your mana. And Destructive Chain Lightning will give you a chance to form Crackling Energy from your Chain Lightning, and Crackling Energy is needed for this build. Next, I put 1 1 point into devastation and 3 points into elemental dominance, and this will increase our mastery skills damage. Now next for the defensive skills, I put 1 point into flame shield, 1 point into enhanced flame shield, and 1 point into mystical flame shield. And this is just one of the best barriers in the game. You become completely invincible with flame shield. Next, I put 1 point into teleport, 1 point into enhanced teleport, and 1 point into shimmering teleport. And this is just one of the best and fastest movement skill in the game. Next, I put 1 point into ice armor, a point into enhanced ice armor, and a point into shimmering ice armor. And this skill is really good for survivability. Next, I put 1 point into frost nova, a point into enhanced frost nova, and a point into mystical frost nova. And this will freeze and apply vulnerable to enemies. Next, I put 1 point into elemental entombment, and this will give us a chance to reset one of our defensive skills. And I put 3 points into glass cannon, and this will greatly increase our damage. Next, for the conjuration skills, I put 3 points into precision magic, and this will greatly increase our lucky hit chance. And lucky hit chance is really important for this build. And next, I put 3 points into conjuration mastery, and this will greatly increase your damage when you use your ultimate skill, because you will have lightning spears going everywhere. And next, I put 1 point into align the elements and 1 point into protection, and these skills are really good for survivability. Okay, so next for the mastery skills, I put 5 points into ball of lightning, a point into enhanced ball of lightning, and a point into wizard's ball of lightning. And this is our main damage dealing skill, and ball of lightning will also help form crackling energy. Next, I put 3 points into static discharge, and this will give us a chance for our shock skills to form crackling energy. And next, I put 3 points into invigorating conduit, and this skill is really important because absorbing crackling energy you will gain 12 mana, and with this build you need as much mana regain as possible. Next, I put 1 point into inner flames and 3 points into devouring blaze. Now, even though critical strike damage is now considered an additive damage bucket, the skill is still really strong to increase our damage. Okay, so next for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into unstable currents, a point into prime unstable currents, and a point into supreme unstable currents. And this ultimate skill will just basically destroy groups of enemies and can easily crush bosses in seconds. Next, I put 1 point into coursing currents and 3 points into conduction, and this will increase our movement speed for speed farming. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into overflowing energy, and this will greatly reduce your shock skills cooldowns when crackling energy hits an enemy. Okay, so next let's check out the gear. Now I do want to mention that I'm using all legendary gear and I'm not using any unique gear. The thing is, unique gear is pretty rare to find and you might not even get the one you want. But I'll share some unique gear that you can use if you can't find the right stats on your legendary gear. And I'm just going to go over the important stats and legendary aspect for each piece of gear. But I'll have a D4 build planner in the description below with the best stats and the legendary aspects you're looking for. So starting with the helmet, you're looking for cooldown reduction and total armor. And the legendary aspect I have is Frost Nova gains an additional charge, but the cooldown per charge is increased by 33%. Now, one other stat you're looking for on your defensive gear is poison resistance. So you can either get this on your helmet, your chest armor, your pants, or your boots. And the reason you want at least one poison resistance stat is that you can max out your poison resistance. Because when fighting Uber Dario, and when he does poison damage to you, it will barely harm you. And this legendary aspect is really good because having an additional charge of Frost Nova will also proc the legendary aspect Prodigy, which will regain you mana. Next, for the chest armor, you're looking for damage reduction stats and total armor. And the legendary aspect I have is that you take 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Now for the gloves, you're looking for attack speed, lucky hit chance, and a stat that gives you a chance to restore your primary resource. And the fourth stat you're looking for is critical strike chance. And the legendary aspect I have is that ball of lightning orbits around you and deals 23% increased damage. And this is basically the most important legendary aspect for this build. This will allow your ball of lightnings to orbit around you, making you deal massive amounts of damage. Next, for the pants, you're looking for damage reduction stats and ranks to ball of lightning. And the legendary aspect I have is that you gain 1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 60%. And this legendary aspect is just one of the best defensive legendary aspects in the game. Next, for the boots, you're looking for movement speed and mana cost reduction, and ranks to teleport is also really good. And the legendary aspect I have is that you gain 20% movement speed. Lose this bonus for 2.5 seconds after taking damage. Now for the weapon, you're looking for a one-handed wand, so you can get the base stat lucky hit chance. And the stats you're looking for is intelligence and high rolls of damage numbers. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 28% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. Now for the offhand, you're looking for cooldown reduction, lucky hit chance, mana cost reduction, and resource regeneration. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 24% increased damage while you have a barrier active. And next for the amulet, you're looking for movement speed, mana cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. And the legendary aspect I have is that you deal 53% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. Now for the rings, the stats you're looking for are resource regeneration, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and a high damage stat. And the first ring's legendary aspect I have is that each time chain lightning bounces, gain 3 mana. And this legendary aspect is really important for mana regeneration. And on the second ring, the legendary aspect I have is that using a cooldown restores 15 mana. And because majority of our skills are cooldown skills, this legendary aspect is really good for restoring mana. Okay, so that's pretty much the best stats and legendary aspects you're looking for on your gear for this build. Now there are some unique gears that you can use for this build if you're able to find these unique gears, or you may not be able to find the right stats on your legendary gear and you found these unique gears first. So the Godslayer crown is a good unique gear for your helmet, because when you stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, you deal 30% increased damage to them for 3 seconds. Or if you found the Soul Brand unique chest piece, this will allow your healing potions to instantly grant you a barrier, and you also gain damage reduction while you have a barrier active. And for the pants, you can use the Tybalt's Will unique pants, and this will greatly increase your damage while you're unstoppable and 4 seconds after. And last but not least, you can use the Flicker Step for your unique boots, and this will reduce your ultimate cooldown each enemy you evade through. So that's pretty much the best unique gear to use for this build if you find these unique gears first, and you can't find the right stats on your legendary gear. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board. Now the Paragon Board is one of the biggest source to multiply our damage. So with this Paragon Board, I took 8 glyphs to maximize the multiplier damage. But I'm just going to quickly go over the Paragon Board and the glyphs, and I'll have a D4 build planner in the description below with the full Paragon Board layout. So starting with the starter board, I went with the Exploit glyph, and this will greatly increase our damage to vulnerable enemies. And for the second Paragon Board, I took the Burning Instinct Paragon Board, and the glyph I took is the Destruction glyph, and this will greatly increase our critical strike damage. And I highly recommend taking these magic nodes and this rare node, Safeguard, to increase your defense and survivability. Then I headed this way, and for the next Paragon Board I took Enchantment Master, and the glyph I'm using is Tactician, and this will greatly increase our damage after using a defensive skill. Then I headed down this way, and the next Paragon Board I took is Ceaseless Conduit, and the glyph I took is Elementalist, and this will greatly increase our damage when dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage. And the reason the Firebolt enchantment is really good is so we can get this multiplier when we deal fire damage. Now we do also have Flame Shield for the fire damage, but you should be using Flame Shield for more defense and survivability. Then I headed this way, and the next Paragon Board I took is Frigid Fate, and the glyph I'm using is Charged, and this will greatly increase our damage after picking up Crackling Energy. And with this build, there's always going to be Crackling Energy around. I also took the Frigid Fate legendary node. Now even though we are not building cold damage, this legendary node will give us a 12% multiplier damage, as you can see, just because of our stats. So this legendary node is one of the best legendary nodes for the Sorcerer, and you should always take this legendary node even if you're not building into cold damage. And with this Paragon Board, I did split it into 2 directions. So first heading up, and the next Paragon Board I took is Searing Heat, and the glyph I'm using is Unleash, and basically this will increase your damage and increase your mana regeneration after spending 50 mana. Then I headed this way, and for the next Paragon Board I took Elemental Summoner, and the glyph I'm using is Adept, and this will increase the area of our mastery skills. And then coming back to the Frigid Fate Paragon Board, and then heading this way, I took the Static Surge Paragon Board, and the glyph I'm using is Flame Feeder, and this will greatly increase your damage to burning enemies, which is another reason I took the Firebolt enchantment. Now there are some other glyphs that you can take instead of the ones I have taken, like the Control glyph, but just be aware that the Control glyph won't affect Uber bosses, because the bosses will die before they get staggered and crowd controlled. So taking other glyphs would be more beneficial when fighting Uber bosses, but when dungeon farming, the Control glyph is really good. And make sure you check the glyph's requirements to get the additional bonus, because that's where all the multiplier damage comes from. Okay, so this is probably one of the best Paragon Board layouts for this build, and of course I'll have a D4 build planner in the description below with the full Paragon Board layout. Okay, so next here are some tips on how to easily defeat Uber Lilith with this build. So the first tip when fighting Uber Lilith is that you want to build as much damage from your gear and skills as much as possible, and you can technically ignore your defense. The reason why is that you want to one-shot her in phase 1, and in phase 2 you want to do huge amounts of damage right at the beginning of phase 2, because then you will basically skip all her one-shot mechanics. The next tip is in phase 1, and you want to save your Flame Shield just in case you don't one-shot her, and she does her wave attack that can one-shot you. You can then flame shield, which will make you invincible and easily skip the wave mechanic. And the last tip is to save some crackling energy before phase 2, and then start casting your ball lightnings and pick up the crackling energy and cast more ball lightnings right before she respawns for phase 2. You want to do as much damage to her right at the start of phase 2, so you can skip all her one-shot mechanics. And with these tips, you should easily defeat Uber Lilith with this build. Okay, so next here are some tips on how to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. So the first tip is that you want to focus a little more on defense compared to offense when doing high level nightmare dungeons. So getting a lot of armor and damage reduction stats are recommended. The next tip is that you want to run the dungeon a little slower than you would normally do, because you want to wait for your skills to be off cooldown, especially your barrier skills. Your barriers will allow you to tank through the dungeons with ease. And the last tip is that you want to switch some of your skill points from the skill tree when running high level nightmare dungeons. And here are the changes I made on the skill tree for this build. You want to focus a little more on defense and survivability compared to offense, because there are a lot of enemies that can one-shot you in the higher level nightmare dungeons. So a couple skill points to change around. So first, you want to take out all the points out of glass cannon, because glass cannon will reduce your defense and survivability in return for offense. And then you want to take 2 points out of static discharge. So with this change, we should get 5 skill points back. So with the 5 points, you want to max out mana shield and protection. So just switching around those 5 points got you a lot of defense and survivability. And with this new skill tree layout, you should easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons with this build. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest Ball of Lightning build for the Sorcerer in Season 2. You should be able to easily clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons and destroy Uber Lilith and any other Uber bosses with this build without the need of any unique gears. And if you're still leveling, definitely check out this video for the fastest and easiest leveling build for the Sorcerer in Season 2. Hope this helps, and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,